The blizzard hit Montana territory so hard that Hannah Bellamy thought she might die before she reached the next town, her fingers already turning blue beneath the torn remnants of her cotton gloves. She had been traveling west for 3 weeks now, fleeing the suffocating life her brother had tried to force upon her back in St. Louis. And the November cold of 1877 had caught her completely unprepared. Her horse had thrown a shoe 2 days back, and she'd been leading the limping mare through increasingly treacherous mountain passes ever since, watching her breath crystallize in the air and feeling her extremities grow number with each passing hour. The wind howled through the pine trees like something alive and angry, tearing at her worn traveling cloak and finding every gap in her inadequate clothing. Hannah's teeth chattered so violently she'd bitten her tongue twice, tasting copper blood mixed with the cold. She couldn't feel her toes anymore, hadn't been able to for miles, and when she tried to grip the mare's reins tighter, her fingers simply wouldn't obey. They shook uncontrollably, trembling like aspen leaves in a storm, and she watched with detached fascination as the leather slipped through her grasp entirely. That was when she saw him. He emerged from the white curtain of snow like something from a dream, or perhaps a hallucination brought on by the cold. The man stood well over 6 feet tall, his shoulders impossibly broad beneath a heavy bearskin coat. Long, dark hair fell past his shoulders, whipping in the wind, and his face was all hard angles and weathered bronze skin. Muscles strained against his buckskin shirt where the coat fell open, and he moved through the deep snow with an ease that seemed almost supernatural. He carried a rifle in one hand and what looked like several rabbits slung over his shoulder. "Jesus Christ," he said, his voice a deep rumble that somehow cut through the wind. "You're half frozen." Hannah tried to respond, tried to tell him she was fine, that she just needed directions to the nearest town, but her jaw wouldn't cooperate. All that came out was a pathetic whimper followed by more violent shaking. Her knees buckled, and suddenly those massive arms were catching her before she hit the ground. "I've got you," he said, and there was something in his tone, something warm and solid that made her want to believe him. "My cabin's not far. Can you walk?" She nodded, though she wasn't sure if it was true. He kept one arm around her waist, supporting most of her weight, and grabbed her horse's reins with his free hand. The mare followed obediently, as if she too recognized that this man meant safety. The cabin materialized through the snow after what felt like both seconds and hours. It was sturdy, built from thick logs chinked with mud and moss, with a stone chimney from which blessed smoke was rising. He kicked the door open and guided her inside, and the wave of heat that hit her was so intense it was almost painful. "Sit," he commanded, steering her toward a chair near the fireplace. "Don't get too close to the fire yet. You warm up too fast, you'll hurt worse than the cold." Hannah collapsed into the chair, still shaking, and watched through blurred vision as he moved around the cabin with practiced efficiency. He was even more impressive in the firelight, all hard muscle and controlled power. His hair was actually a rich brown shot through with hints of copper, and when he turned to look at her, she saw his eyes were a startling pale blue, like ice on a mountain lake. "Name's Irving," he said, setting a kettle on a hook over the fire. "I trap these mountains, have for about 5 years now. You got a name, or should I just call you woman who's trying to freeze to death?" "Hannah," she managed, though her voice came out as barely a whisper. "Hannah Bellamy." "Well, Hannah Bellamy, you picked a hell of a day to be wandering around in the mountains." He crouched in front of her, and she saw his eyes widen as he took in her hands. "May I?" she nodded, not sure what he was asking permission for until his large, calloused hands took hers gently. The contrast was startling. His hands were warm and rough, twice the size of hers, and he handled her frozen fingers with surprising tenderness. "This isn't good," he muttered. "These gloves are useless. What possessed you to head into the mountains this time of year with cotton gloves?" "Didn't have a choice," Hannah said, finding her voice again as warmth slowly seeped back into her body. "Had to leave St. Louis fast. Didn't exactly have time to shop for winter gear." Hayes looked up at her, those pale eyes searching her face. "Running from the law." "Running from my brother," she said, which was close enough to the truth. "He wanted to marry me off to a man 40 years my senior, a business associate of his. I'm 22 years old, and he thought he had the right to sell me like livestock." Something flickered in Hayes's expression, something dark and angry, but his touch on her hands remained gentle. "Your brother sounds like he needs a lesson in respect." "He needs a lot of things," Hannah said. "But mostly, he needs to be 1,000 miles away from me, which is exactly what I was trying to arrange when this storm hit." Hayes nodded slowly, then released her hands. "Stay put. I'm going to make you some tea, and then I've got work to do." "Work?" Hannah blinked. "In this storm?" "For you," he clarified, moving to tend the kettle. "Those gloves of yours are worse than useless. You need proper protection for your hands, or you're going to lose fingers if you keep traveling in this weather." Hannah wanted to protest, to tell him she'd be fine, but looking down at her red, swollen fingers, she knew he was right. The cotton gloves had torn beyond repair, and she had no others. She'd used most of her money to buy the horse and supplies, and by the time she'd realized how cold Montana would be, she'd been too far from any town to rectify her mistakes. Hayes brought her a tin cup filled with dark, steaming tea. It was bitter and strong, but it was hot, and that was all that mattered. She wrapped both hands around the cup, savoring the warmth seeping into her palms. "Drink that slow," Hayes instructed. "I'm going to tend to your horse, and then I'll start on those gloves." "You don't have to do that," Hannah said. "I can't pay you. I barely have enough money to make it to California." Hayes paused at the door, looking back at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Didn't ask for payment. Where I come from, you help people who need helping. That's just how it is." Then he was gone, letting in a blast of cold air before the door shut firmly behind him. Hannah sat in the chair, sipping her tea and looking around the cabin. It was surprisingly neat for a bachelor's dwelling. The bed in the corner was made with military precision, furs piled high for warmth. Traps and tools hung on the walls in organized rows. A small shelf held maybe a dozen books, their spines worn from repeated reading. This was a man who lived alone but lived deliberately, with care and purpose. She must have dozed off because the next thing she knew, Hayes was back inside, his hair and shoulders dusted with snow. He carried her saddlebags and another armful of something she couldn't quite make out. "Storm's getting worse," he said, setting her things down carefully. "You're not going anywhere for a few days at least. Hope you don't mind bunking here." Hannah's heart skipped, not from fear, which surprised her. This man could have done anything to her when he found her half frozen in the snow, but instead, he'd shown her nothing but kindness. Still, propriety demanded she at least make a token protest. "I couldn't possibly impose," she began. "You'll impose a lot more if you freeze to death and I have to bury you in the spring," Hayes said flatly. "Look, I know it's not proper, you staying here with me and no chaperone, but you see any churches nearby, any neighbors to clutch their pearls and gossip. This is the wilderness, and out here, survival matters more than society's rules." He had a point, several of them actually. Hannah nodded slowly. "Thank you, I'll try not to be a burden." "Didn't say you were a burden," Hayes said, moving to the table where he'd set down his bundle. "Now let me see your hands again. I need to measure." Hannah stood on shaky legs and moved to join him. As she got closer, she saw what he'd brought in. Several rabbit pelts, already cleaned and stretched, soft and white as fresh snow. He'd also brought in some leather straps, sinew, and various tools. "You're really going to make me gloves?" she asked, sitting across from him. Said I would. Hayes took her right hand first, his large fingers gentle as he measured the length and width. His hands were warm now from being inside, and Hannah found herself acutely aware of every point of contact. He had workman's hands, scarred and calloused from hard living, but his touch was careful, almost reverent. "You have small hands," he observed, not as a criticism but as a simple fact. "Delicate. These mountains are going to eat you alive if you're not careful." "I'm tougher than I look," Hannah said, though even as she said it, she knew how ridiculous it sounded. She was sitting in a stranger's cabin, half frozen and completely dependent on his kindness. Not exactly a strong argument for her resilience, but Hayes just nodded. "I believe you. Takes guts to run the way you did. Takes more guts to keep going when things get hard." He released her right hand and took the left, repeating his measurements. "But guts only get you so far. You need the right equipment too." He worked in silence for a while, and Hannah watched, fascinated. His hands moved with surprising dexterity for someone so large, cutting the rabbit fur with precise strokes, laying out patterns on the table. He'd clearly done this kind of work before, and she found herself wondering about him. What had brought Hayes Irving to these mountains? Why did a man who looked like he could have commanded armies choose to live alone in the wilderness, trapping animals and reading worn books by firelight? "How long have you been up here?" she asked finally, unable to contain her curiosity. "5 years, like I said." Hayes didn't look up from his work. "Came out after the war. Couldn't stomach cities anymore, all those people crowded together, all that noise. These mountains, they're quiet. Honest. A bear wants to kill you, it doesn't pretend to be your friend first." Hannah heard the weight in those words, the history he wasn't saying outright. "You fought." "Yeah, just one word, but it carried volumes. Union. Started when I was 18, ended when I was 21, saw things no one should see, did things I'm not proud of." He finally looked up, those pale eyes meeting hers. "War changes a man, makes it hard to live around people who can't understand." "I'm sorry," Hannah said softly. Hayes shrugged, returning to his work. "Long time ago now, I've made my peace with it, mostly. The mountains helped with that. There's something about living out here, just you and nature, that puts things in perspective. Don't you get lonely? Sometimes." He started stitching, his needle moving through the soft rabbit fur with practiced ease. "But lonely's different from alone. I'm alone most of the time, but I'm only lonely on occasion. When I was in the war, surrounded by thousands of men, I was lonelier than I've ever been out here." Hannah thought she understood that. She'd been surrounded by people in St. Louis, by her brother and his friends and the entire social circle he'd forced her into, but she'd never felt more alone. At least here, with this quiet mountain man and his simple honesty, she felt like she could breathe. "What about you?" Hayes asked, surprising her. "What's waiting for you in California?" "Nothing," Hannah admitted. "Or maybe everything. I don't have family out there, no job lined up, no prospects. I just knew I had to get as far from my brother as possible, and California seemed far enough." "That's a hell of a gamble. So is staying somewhere that's killing you slowly." Hannah wrapped her arms around herself. "My brother, he's not a bad man exactly. He just thinks women are property. Thinks he has the right to control every aspect of my life because our father left him in charge when he died. I tried to be obedient, tried to play the part he wanted, but when he told me I was marrying Marcus Thornton, I just couldn't do it anymore." Hayes's jaw tightened. "Marcus Thornton, that name sounds familiar. He owns half the warehouses on the Mississippi River, very wealthy, very powerful, and very interested in acquiring a young wife to show off at parties." Hannah's voice went flat. My brother thought it was a great opportunity. I thought it was a prison sentence. So you ran. So I ran. Hannah let out a long breath. Took what money I could scrape together, bought a horse and some supplies, and headed west. I figured I'd find work somewhere, maybe as a teacher or a seamstress. I'm educated, I can read and write and do figures. That has to count for something. It counts for a lot, Hayes said. More than you might think out here. These territories are growing, towns sprouting up everywhere. Someone with education and skills can do well. He held up the glove he'd been working on, examining it critically. You'll need to be smart, though. A woman alone is vulnerable, especially when winter's setting in. I know, Hannah said quietly. I've been lucky so far. Lucky that you found me instead of someone else, you mean? Hayes set down the glove and met her eyes. Not everyone out here is friendly. Some men, they see a woman alone, they think that's an invitation. You need to be careful. There was no threat in his words, only warning, and Hannah appreciated it. I'll be careful. I've got a pistol, though I'm not much of a shot. I'll teach you before you leave, Hayes said. Teach you properly so you can actually hit what you're aiming at. A gun's no good if you can't use it. You do that. Rather have you know how to protect yourself than hear later that something happened to you. He picked up the glove again, continuing his stitching. Call me sentimental, but I'd like to think you make it to California in one piece. Hannah felt warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. Thank you, Hayes, for everything. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't found me. Probably frozen, he said bluntly, but there was a hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. But you didn't, so no point dwelling on it. Tomorrow, when the storm breaks, I'll check your horse's hoof. Might be able to fix that shoe if I've got the right size. If not, you'll need to head down to Murphy's once the weather clears. Murphy's? Small town about 15 miles south of here. Not much to it, but they've got a blacksmith and a general store. You'll need proper winter gear before you head over the mountains. He paused. Actually, you should probably wait until spring before trying to cross. The passes get deadly this time of year. Hannah's heart sank. I can't wait that long. My brother, if he's following me, I need to keep moving. Your brother going to be able to track you in this weather? Hayes pointed at the window, where snow was falling so thick the world outside had disappeared. Winter's here, Hannah. It's here, and it's not leaving until March at least. Trying to cross the mountains now is suicide, and I didn't pull you from one frozen death just so you can go find another. He had a point, much as Hannah hated to admit it. She'd been so focused on running, on putting distance between herself and St. Louis, that she hadn't really thought about what winter in the mountains would mean. Looking at the window, at the wall of white beyond, she realized just how foolish she'd been. So what do I do? She asked quietly. Hayes was quiet for a long moment, his needle pausing in its work. When he spoke, his voice was careful, measured. You could stay in Murphy's for the winter. Find work, save money, wait for the passes to clear. It's not a bad little town. People mind their own business mostly. And if my brother's men find me, then they find you and you deal with it. But honestly, I doubt they will. You've put a lot of ground between you and St. Louis, and men from the city don't tend to do well in Montana winters. Odds are your brother assumes you're already dead. It was harsh, but probably true. Hannah had barely survived, and she'd been lucky enough to stumble across Hayes. Her brother's hired men, if he'd even sent any, would likely turn back at the first serious snowfall. I suppose you're right, she said slowly. I just hate the idea of stopping, of staying in one place where I can be found. Sometimes stopping is the smartest thing you can do. Hayes finished the first glove and held it up, examining it in the firelight. There, try this on. Hannah took the glove, marveling at the softness of the rabbit fur. It was beautiful, far nicer than anything she'd owned before. The fur was on the inside, soft against her skin, while the outside was smooth leather, carefully stitched and reinforced at the seams. She slipped it on and it fit perfectly, snug but not tight, covering her hand and wrist completely. "It's wonderful," she breathed. "Hayes, this is the nicest thing anyone's ever made for me." He ducked his head, and if she didn't know better, Hannah would have sworn he was blushing. "It's just a glove. Practical. You need it to survive." "It's more than that," Hannah insisted. She flexed her fingers in the glove, feeling how the rabbit fur moved with her skin, keeping the warmth in while still allowing movement. "This must have taken you hours." "Got nothing but time up here," Hayes muttered, but she could tell he was pleased. "Now hold still. I need to start on the other one." Hannah watched as he worked, his large hands moving with that same surprising delicacy. The cabin was warm now, almost cozy, and the sound of the wind outside only made the interior feel safer by comparison. She found her eyes drifting over Hayes's form, taking in details she'd been too cold to notice before. His hands were scarred, thin white lines crisscrossing his knuckles and fingers. His shoulders were impossibly broad, straining against the buckskin shirt, and she could see the definition of muscle in his forearms where his sleeves were rolled up. His face, weathered by sun and wind, was handsome in a rough way, all strong jaw and straight nose and those startling pale eyes. He looked up suddenly, catching her staring, and Hannah felt heat flood her cheeks. "Sorry," she mumbled. "I was just thinking about how different you are from the men I knew in St. Louis." She figured honesty was the best approach. They were all soft, concerned with appearances and social standing. "You're different, different good or different bad." There was amusement in his voice. "Different good," Hannah said firmly. "You're real. What you see is what you get. There's no pretense, no games. I like that." Hayes was quiet for a moment, his needle pausing. "City folk always think mountain men are some kind of noble savages, all rough and honest and pure. Truth is, I'm just a man who couldn't figure out how to live in civilization anymore. Don't romanticize me, Hannah. I'm no hero." "I didn't say you were a hero," Hannah countered. "I said you were real. There's a difference." He smiled at that, a real smile that transformed his face, making him look younger and less careworn. "Fair enough. You're pretty real yourself, you know. Most women I've met would have fainted or had hysterics finding themselves alone in a cabin with a strange man." "Most women you've met haven't been running from an arranged marriage and half frozen in a blizzard," Hannah pointed out. "Changes your priorities." "I suppose it does." Hayes returned to his stitching, but the atmosphere in the cabin had shifted somehow, become more comfortable, more intimate. "You plan to ever marry? Or has your brother's attempt at matchmaking put you off the idea entirely?" "I'm not opposed to marriage," Hannah said slowly, thinking about it. "I'm opposed to being treated like property. If I ever marry, it'll be to someone who sees me as an equal partner, someone who respects my opinions and doesn't try to control me. I'd rather die alone than live in a cage." "Can't say I blame you." Hayes tied off a thread and started another seam. "Marriage is supposed to be a partnership, not ownership. My parents had that back before the war. They worked together, respected each other. That's how it should be." "Are they still alive?" Hannah asked gently. "My mother is. Lives in Ohio with my sister. Haven't seen them in years." There was regret in his voice. "Keep meaning to visit, but something always comes up. Or maybe I'm just a coward." "You're not a coward. You fought in a war. Fighting in a war is easy compared to facing your mother and explaining why you've been avoiding her for 5 years." Hayes's smile was rueful. "She writes me letters. They catch up to me eventually, forwarded through the trading posts. She wants me to come home, settle down, find a nice girl, and give her grandchildren." "That doesn't sound so terrible." It sounds like a cage to me, Hayes said quietly. Same as marriage sounded to you. My mother, she means well, but she wants me to be someone I'm not anymore. The boy who left for the war, he's dead. I'm what's left, and I don't fit in her world anymore. Hannah understood that more than he probably realized. She'd been trying to fit herself into her brother's world, into society's expectations, and it had been slowly suffocating her. Maybe she and Hayes weren't so different after all. Both of them were people who didn't quite fit the molds others had tried to press them into. Maybe we're both running, she said softly. Hayes looked up at her, something complicated flickering in those pale eyes. Maybe we are, but at least we're honest about it. He finished the second glove as darkness fell outside, the storm still raging with unabated fury. Hannah tried on both gloves, marveling at the warmth, at the way they fit as if they'd been made specifically for her, which of course they had. Hayes had taken her hands, had measured and cut and stitched with care, and created something beautiful and functional. The rabbit fur was soft against her skin, and the leather exterior was sturdy enough to protect against wind and snow. They're perfect, she said, flexing her fingers. Hayes, I don't know how to thank you. Don't need thanks, just needed doing. But he looked pleased, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Now, about dinner. You like venison stew, because that's what I've got unless you want hardtack and jerky. Venison stew sounds like heaven, Hannah admitted. Her stomach growled at the mere mention of food, reminding her that she'd eaten nothing but dried biscuits and old jerky for the past 2 days. Hayes moved to the fire, pulling a pot from somewhere and beginning to prepare their meal. Hannah watched him work, noting the efficiency of his movements. He'd clearly been living alone for a long time, had developed routines and systems that made solitary life manageable. He added chunks of venison to the pot along with wild onions, some kind of root vegetables she didn't recognize, and herbs that filled the cabin with a wonderful aroma. "Can I help?" she offered. "You can set the table such as it is." Hayes gestured to a small cabinet. "Bowls and spoons in there. I've only got 2 of everything, but that should work since it's just us." Hannah found the dishes, simple tin bowls and spoons that had been worn smooth with use. She set them on the rough wooden table, along with 2 tin cups. It was simple, almost primitive compared to the elaborate place settings she'd grown up with, but there was something honest about it that appealed to her. This was real life, stripped of all pretense and artifice. Just food and shelter and the basic necessities of survival. "You must think I'm terribly naive," she said suddenly. "Running west with no plan, inadequate supplies, no idea what I was getting into." Hayes stirred the pot, not answering right away. When he did speak, his voice was thoughtful. "I think you're brave. Maybe foolish too, but mostly brave. Takes courage to leave everything you know behind and strike out on your own. Most people never do it. They stay in their cages because it's safe, because it's familiar, even when those cages are killing them. Is that what you did?" "Left your cage, more or less." Hayes ladled stew into the bowls, the rich smell making Hannah's mouth water. "The war was my excuse. After I saw what I saw, did what I did, I couldn't go back to pretending everything was normal. Couldn't sit in church on Sundays and listen to sermons about morality when I'd killed men, watched friends die, lived in hell for 3 years. So I left. Came west, kept going until I found a place that felt right." They sat down to eat, and Hannah took her first bite of the stew. It was delicious, rich and savory, the meat tender and the vegetables perfectly cooked. She hadn't realized how hungry she was until that moment, and she had to force herself to eat slowly, not wanting to make herself sick. "This is wonderful," she said between bites. "Where did you learn to cook?" "Necessity mostly. You learn fast when the alternative is starving or eating terrible food." Hayes ate steadily, efficiently, like a man who viewed meals as fuel rather than pleasure. My mother tried to teach me some basics before I left, but most of what I know I figured out through trial and error. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, the warmth of the food spreading through Hannah's body, chasing away the last lingering chill from her time in the cold. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the cabin, everything was warm and safe and surprisingly peaceful. Hannah found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't since leaving St. Louis, as if Hayes's cabin was some kind of sanctuary where the rest of the world couldn't reach her. "Tell me about the mountains," she said finally. "What's it like living out here year-round?" Hayes considered the question, his pale eyes thoughtful. "It's hard but simple. Every season has its challenges. Winter's the worst, obviously. The cold, the isolation, the constant work just to keep from freezing. Spring's mud and flooding, everything thawing out at once. Summer's mosquitoes and heat and trying to preserve enough meat to last through winter. Fall's the easiest, I suppose. The weather's pleasant, the animals are fattening up for winter, and the colors are incredible. Don't you ever wish for company, for someone to share it with, sometimes?" Hayes met her eyes across the table. "Gets quiet, like I said. And there are times when I'd like to have someone to talk to, someone to share the burden with. But finding someone who could live this life, who'd want to live this life, that's not easy. Most women want civilization, want towns and stores and neighbors. Can't say I blame them." "Some women might surprise you," Hannah said softly. "Some women might value freedom and honesty over social calls and tea parties." Something shifted in Hayes's expression, something that made Hannah's heart beat faster. "You think so? I know so." She held his gaze, seeing something in those pale eyes that made her breath catch. There was attraction there, she realized, had probably been there since he'd first carried her into the cabin. But there was more than that. There was respect, genuine interest, a recognition of kindred spirits. The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility, until Hayes broke it by standing abruptly. "You must be exhausted. You should get some sleep. Take the bed. I'll sleep by the fire." "I can't take your bed," Hannah protested. "You can and you will," Hayes said firmly. "You're still recovering from nearly freezing to death. You need proper rest, and the bed's warmer than the floor. Where will you sleep?" "I've got furs enough to make a bedroll by the fire. I'll be fine. Done it before plenty of times." He was already moving, pulling furs down from hooks on the wall, creating a surprisingly comfortable-looking nest near the hearth. Hannah wanted to argue more, but exhaustion was catching up with her, the warmth and food and relative safety conspiring to make her bones feel heavy. She stood, moving to the bed, and found it was indeed comfortable, the furs piled high and soft. She removed her boots and outer layers, keeping her dress on for propriety's sake, and slipped beneath the furs. "Thank you, Hayes," she said quietly, "for everything. The gloves, the food, the shelter. I won't forget your kindness." "Just doing what's right," he said, settling into his bedroll. "Sleep well, Hannah." Hannah closed her eyes, listening to the storm outside and the crackle of the fire. She could hear Hayes breathing, steady and even, and found the sound comforting. For the first time in weeks, she felt safe, truly safe. And as she drifted off to sleep, she found herself thinking that maybe running west hadn't been such a terrible idea after all. She woke to pale morning light filtering through the cabin's small window and the smell of coffee brewing. For a moment, Hannah was disoriented, unsure where she was, and then memory returned. The storm, the cold, Hayes and his unexpected kindness. She sat up, looking around, and saw him at the fire, tending a pot. "Morning," he said without turning around. "Storm's passed, but there's about 3 feet of fresh snow outside. Coffee's almost ready." Hannah stood, stretching muscles stiff from travel and cold, and moved to join him. Through the window, she could see he was right. The world outside was transformed, everything buried under a thick white blanket. The sky was clear now, pale blue and achingly bright. "How did you know I was awake?" she asked. "Your breathing changed." Hayes poured coffee into the 2 tin cups. "You learn to pay attention to things like that when you live alone. Small changes often mean big differences." He handed her a cup, and their fingers brushed. Even through the new gloves, Hannah felt the warmth of his touch, felt something spark between them. Hayes felt it too, she could tell by the way his eyes widened slightly, the way he held her gaze a beat longer than necessary. "Thank you," she said, taking the coffee. It was strong and bitter, but she was grateful for it. They drank in silence for a few minutes, standing side by side, looking out at the transformed landscape. Hannah found herself acutely aware of Hayes's presence, of his size and warmth, and the solid steadiness he radiated. He smelled like wood smoke and leather and something else, something masculine and appealing that made her want to lean closer. "I should check on your horse," Hayes said finally. "See if I can do something about that shoe. I'll come with you." They bundled up, Hannah marveling again at how well the rabbit fur gloves worked. Her hands stayed warm even as they stepped out into the frigid air. The world was breathtakingly beautiful, the snow pristine and sparkling in the morning sun, the pine trees weighted down with white frosting. Hannah's horse was in a small lean-to attached to the cabin, sharing space with Hayes's mule, and she seemed comfortable enough. Hayes examined the thrown shoe carefully, then checked the other hooves. "Good news is, the hoof itself looks fine. I can probably put a temporary shoe on her that'll get you to Murphy's, and the blacksmith there can do a proper job." "That would be wonderful," Hannah said. "I've been so worried about her." She watched as Hayes worked, noting the gentleness with which he handled the horse. His large hands moved carefully, making sure not to cause any discomfort, and the mare stood quietly, as if she trusted him implicitly. It took him about an hour, working with tools he kept in the lean-to, and when he was done, the horse had a serviceable shoe that would hold until they could get to town. "There," Hayes said, patting the mare's neck. "That should do for now." "You're very good with animals," Hannah observed. "Animals are honest. They don't lie or play games. You treat them right, they treat you right." Hayes straightened, brushing snow off his pants. "Unlike people who are complicated and unpredictable." "Am I complicated and unpredictable?" Hannah asked, somewhat amused. Hayes looked at her, really looked at her, and Hannah felt heat rise in her cheeks despite the cold. "You're complicated, yes, but not in a bad way. You're interesting. Most people aren't interesting." Before Hannah could respond, they heard voices in the distance. Hayes's whole demeanor changed instantly, his body tensing, one hand moving to the rifle he'd leaned against the lean-to wall. "Get inside," he said quietly. "Now." "What is it?" "Don't know yet. Could be trappers, could be miners, could be trouble. Until I know which, I want you out of sight." Hannah didn't argue. She moved quickly back to the cabin, but instead of hiding, she positioned herself near the window where she could see what was happening. Hayes stood in front of the cabin, rifle held loosely but ready, watching as 3 figures emerged from the trees. They were rough-looking men, dressed in a hodgepodge of furs and worn clothing. One of them had a nasty scar running down the side of his face, and all of them looked like they hadn't seen soap or a razor in months. They stopped about 20 feet from Hayes, their eyes taking in the cabin, the lean-to, and undoubtedly noting signs of Hannah's presence. "Morning," the scarred man said. His voice was raspy, unpleasant. "Cold one, ain't it?" "Cold enough," Hayes agreed. His voice was neutral, but Hannah could hear the steel underneath. You boys lost, not lost, just passing through, saw your smoke, thought we'd stop in, maybe warm up a bit. The man's eyes were calculating. You got coffee? We've been out for days. I've got coffee, Hayes said. But I'm not in a social mood. There's a town about 15 miles south, Murphy's. You can get coffee there. The scarred man's smile didn't reach his eyes. That's not very neighborly. We're not neighbors, you're trespassing. One of the other men shifted, and Hannah saw him rest his hand on the pistol at his belt. Her heart started pounding. This was going to go bad, she could feel it, and Hayes was outnumbered 3-1. She remembered the pistol in her saddlebags, the one she'd bought in a town somewhere east of here. Hayes had said she couldn't shoot worth a damn, and he was probably right, but she could at least look threatening. Moving as quietly as possible, Hannah retrieved the pistol, checking to make sure it was loaded. Outside, the tension was escalating. "Look, friend," the scarred man said, taking a step forward. "We don't want trouble. Just some coffee, maybe some food, we can pay." I said no. Hayes raised the rifle slightly, not quite pointing it at them but making his position clear. "Now turn around and head to town." "Maybe we don't feel like heading to town," one of the other men said. "Maybe we feel like staying right here." Hannah moved to the door, pistol in hand. She opened it and stepped out, leveling the weapon at the three men with hands that only shook a little. "He said leave," she called out, her voice steadier than she felt. "So leave." All four men turned to look at her, and Hannah saw Hayes's jaw tighten. He wasn't happy she'd come outside, but he didn't contradict her either. The scarred man laughed. "Well, well, looks like you're not alone after all. Pretty little thing, ain't she? Last warning," Hayes said, and his voice had gone cold, deadly. "Turn around and leave, or this gets ugly." For a long moment, nobody moved. The three strangers seemed to be weighing their options, calculating odds. 3 against 2, but Hayes had a rifle and looked like he knew how to use it, and Hannah might be an unknown quantity. Plus, they'd have to get across 20 feet of open ground under fire. Whatever calculus they were running, they apparently decided it wasn't worth it. The scarred man raised his hands in mock surrender. "Easy there, mountain man. We're going. No need for bloodshed over a cup of coffee." He backed away slowly, his companions doing the same. "Might want to teach your woman better manners, though. Ain't safe, pointing guns at people." They disappeared back into the trees, and Hayes kept his rifle raised until they were completely out of sight. Then he turned to Hannah, his expression thunderous. "What were you thinking?" he demanded. "Coming out here, waving that pistol around. You could have gotten yourself killed." "You were outnumbered," Hannah shot back, her hands starting to shake now that the danger had passed. "I wasn't going to hide inside while you faced them alone." "That's exactly what I told you to do." Hayes strode toward her, taking the pistol from her trembling hands. "These are dangerous men, Hannah, not the kind who follow rules or respect women. If this had gone bad, if shooting had started, you'd have been right in the middle of it." "So would you," Hannah pointed out. "And at least this way you had someone watching your back." Hayes opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. He took a deep breath, clearly trying to calm himself. "Don't do that again, please. I can handle myself, but worrying about keeping you safe while dealing with threats, that's harder." Hannah softened at the genuine concern in his voice. "I'm sorry. I just couldn't stand by and do nothing." "I know." Hayes ran a hand through his hair. "Come on, let's get inside. Those men might come back with friends, and I want to be ready if they do." They spent the rest of the morning preparing for potential trouble. Hayes checked all his weapons, made sure the cabin door could be properly barred, and positioned supplies near windows in case they needed to hold out for a while. Hannah watched and helped where she could, understanding now why Hayes had survived 5 years alone in these mountains. He wasn't just strong and skilled, he was careful, thoughtful, always planning ahead. "You think they'll come back?" she asked as afternoon wore into evening. "Probably not. Men like that are cowards at heart. They prey on the weak and alone, not on someone who's prepared to fight back." Hayes settled into a chair by the fire. "But it's better to be prepared and not need it than the other way around." Hannah sat across from him, watching firelight play across his features. He'd been tense all day, on edge, and she hated that her presence had brought this trouble to his door. If she hadn't been here, those men probably would have just moved on, written Hayes off as another lone trapper not worth bothering. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "This is my fault. If I hadn't come here, you wouldn't have to worry about men like that." Hayes looked at her in surprise. "That's ridiculous. Those men aren't your fault. They're just predators looking for easy prey. Has nothing to do with you. But they saw signs of a woman here and that made you a target." "Hannah, listen to me." Hayes leaned forward, his pale eyes intense. "I've dealt with men like that before. It comes with living out here. Sometimes you run into trappers and miners who are decent folk, and sometimes you run into scum. That's just how it is. You being here didn't cause it." "But you had to protect me," Hannah persisted. "That put you in more danger." "Protecting people who need protecting, that's not a burden. That's just being human." Hayes held her gaze. "You didn't ask to be caught in that storm. You didn't ask for your brother to try to sell you off like property. You're just trying to survive, same as everyone else. There's no shame in that, and there's no shame in needing help sometimes." Hannah felt tears prick at her eyes, though she wasn't sure why. Maybe it was exhaustion, or maybe it was the simple kindness of this mountain man who'd taken her in and protected her without asking for anything in return. Maybe it was the way he looked at her, like she was a person worth protecting, worth caring about. "Thank you," she whispered. "Stop thanking me," Hayes said, but his voice was gentle. "Just promise me you'll be more careful. Once you leave here, once you're on your own again, you need to be smart about who you trust and where you go. I promise." They ate dinner in relative silence, both of them tired from the tension of the day. Outside, night fell fast and hard, the temperature dropping with it. Hannah could hear the wind picking up again, not as fierce as the previous night's storm, but still cold and mean. "Looks like you might be stuck here another day or two," Hayes observed, glancing out the window. "Sorry. I know you want to keep moving." "It's all right," Hannah said, and realized she meant it. The idea of staying in this warm cabin with Hayes for a few more days wasn't the burden she would have expected. If anything, she found herself reluctant to leave, to face the uncertainty of the trail again. That night, Hannah lay in Hayes's bed again, warm under the furs, listening to him breathe by the fire. She thought about the way he'd stood between her and those three men, the way he'd been ready to fight to protect her. She thought about his hands, so large and scarred, yet so gentle when he'd held hers. She thought about his eyes, pale blue like winter ice but warm when he looked at her. She was falling for him, she realized. It was ridiculous, impossible. She'd known him less than 2 days, and yet something about Hayes Irving had gotten under her skin, into her heart. Maybe it was just gratitude, or maybe it was the intimacy of their situation, forced together by circumstance. But it felt like more than that. It felt like recognition, like finding something she hadn't known she'd been looking for. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the wind having blown itself out during the night. Hayes was up before her, as usual, and had coffee and some kind of flatbread ready when she emerged from the bed. "Morning," he said, handing her coffee. "Weather's clear. If you want to head to Murphy's, today would be the day to do it." Hannah's heart sank. Of course. She couldn't stay in his cabin forever, living off his charity. She needed to get to town, find work, start building a life for herself. "That had been the plan all along, right?" she said, trying to sound enthusiastic. "That makes sense." Hayes studied her face. Unless you'd rather stay another day, make sure you're fully recovered from the cold. No, you're right, I should go. Hannah forced herself to say the words. I've imposed on you long enough. Something flickered across Hayes's expression, too fast for her to read. You haven't imposed, but I understand if you want to get to town, start figuring out your next steps. They prepared in silence, Hayes helping her load her saddlebags and check her horse. The temporary shoe he'd fitted looked solid, and the mare seemed eager to move, pawing at the snow. Hannah put on her rabbit fur gloves, flexing her fingers in the warmth, remembering how Hayes had measured her hands, had worked late into the night to create something to keep her safe. I guess this is it, she said, mounting the horse. From up here, Hayes looked even larger, all broad shoulders and solid strength. Thank you again, Hayes, for everything. I won't forget what you did for me. Stay safe, Hayes said. His voice was carefully neutral, but his eyes said something else, something Hannah couldn't quite interpret. Head straight south, follow the creek. You'll hit Murphy's by afternoon if you keep a steady pace. Hannah nodded, not trusting her voice. She turned the mare south, following Hayes's directions, and made herself not look back. It was better this way, she told herself. Clean break. Hayes had his life in the mountains, and she had a new life to build in California. Their paths had crossed briefly, but that was all it was. A moment of kindness from a stranger, nothing more. Except it felt like more. It felt like she was riding away from something important, something that might have been significant if she'd been brave enough to stay. The ride to Murphy's took longer than expected because of the deep snow, but Hayes's directions were perfect. She followed the creek, and just as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, the town came into view. It was small, maybe a dozen buildings clustered along a main street, but it looked solid, established. Hannah could see smoke rising from chimneys, and she heard the distinctive clang of a blacksmith's hammer. She found the livery stable first, arranging for her horse to be properly shod and boarding there while she figured out her next steps. The stableman was an older fellow with kind eyes, and he directed her to the boarding house where she might find a room. Mrs. Patterson, the boarding house owner, was a stout woman in her 50s with shrewd eyes and a no-nonsense manner. She looked Hannah up and down, taking in her worn traveling clothes and probable lack of funds. I've got a room, she said, but I'll need payment up front. $2 a week, and that includes breakfast and dinner. Hannah did quick math in her head. She had about $30 left to her name. At $2 a week, she could afford maybe 3 months if she was very careful, less if she needed to buy anything. She'd need to find work immediately. I can pay for 2 weeks now, Hannah said, and I'm looking for work. I can read and write, I'm good with numbers, and I can sew. Mrs. Patterson's expression softened slightly. What's a literate woman doing out here alone? That's a story I'd like to hear. It's a long story, Hannah said carefully, but the short version is I'm starting over and I need to make my own way. The older woman nodded slowly. Fair enough. I won't pry. As for work, you might try the general store. Old Mr. Henderson's been complaining about needing help with his books. Can't see as well as he used to, and his handwriting's gone all to hell. Thank you, Hannah said gratefully. I'll speak with him tomorrow. She paid for her 2 weeks, and Mrs. Patterson showed her to a small but clean room on the second floor. It had a bed, a washstand, and a small window that looked out over the main street. After weeks of travel and 2 nights in Hayes's cabin, it should have felt like luxury. Instead, it felt lonely. Hannah unpacked her few belongings, hanging her spare dress to air out and placing her brush and mirror on the washstand. She kept the rabbit fur gloves on, not wanting to take them off even inside. They were her connection to Hayes, tangible proof that the past 2 days had been real and not some fever dream brought on by cold and exhaustion. Dinner at the boarding house was simple but good, and Hannah met the other residents. There were 3 other boarders: a young school teacher named Miss Sarah Wright, a miner named Tom who kept to himself, and a traveling salesman named Mr. Fuller who talked incessantly about his wares. They were friendly enough, though Hannah could see the curiosity in their eyes. A single woman traveling alone was unusual, and they clearly wanted to know her story. She kept her answers vague, mentioning family troubles back east and a desire for a fresh start. Miss Wright seemed sympathetic. Mr. Fuller seemed interested in a way that made Hannah uncomfortable, and Tom didn't seem to care one way or another. That night, lying in her narrow bed, Hannah found herself thinking about Hayes. Was he sitting by his fire right now, reading one of his worn books? Did he miss having someone to talk to, or was he relieved to have his solitude back? Did he think about her at all? She pulled the gloves on even though her hands weren't cold, running her fingers over the soft rabbit fur. He'd made these for her, had spent hours crafting something to keep her safe. That wasn't the action of someone who saw her as just a burden or an inconvenience. That was the action of someone who cared, at least a little. The next morning, Hannah woke early and dressed carefully in her least worn dress. She needed to make a good impression if she wanted to secure work. She braided her hair neatly, pinched her cheeks for color, and headed down to breakfast. Mrs. Patterson served oatmeal with dried fruit and strong coffee, and Hannah ate quickly, eager to speak with Mr. Henderson about the bookkeeping position. The general store was easy to find, right in the center of town, and Hannah paused outside to gather her courage before pushing through the door. The interior was dimly lit and crammed with goods of every description. Bolts of cloth, farming tools, canned goods, rope, nails, lanterns, and 100 other items all competed for space. Behind the counter stood a white-haired man with spectacles, squinting down at a ledger. Mr. Henderson. Hannah approached the counter. "My name is Hannah Bellamy. Mrs. Patterson said you might need help with your books." The old man looked up, his eyes magnified behind thick glasses. "Did she now? And what makes you think you can help? I'm educated. I can read, write, and cipher. I've kept household accounts before." That was stretching the truth slightly, but Hannah had helped her father with his personal ledgers before he died. Mr. Henderson studied her for a long moment, then pushed the ledger toward her. "Can you make sense of that?" Hannah looked down at the page. The handwriting was indeed atrocious, nearly illegible, and the numbers seemed to be all over the place with no clear organization. But she could work with this. "I can," she said confidently. "It'll take some time to get it organized properly, but yes, I can fix this." "How much time?" "If I worked half days, probably a week to get caught up, then maybe a few hours a week to keep it current." Mr. Henderson named a price that was less than Hannah had hoped but more than nothing. It would cover her room and board with a little left over. She'd still need to find additional work, but it was a start. "When can you begin?" Mr. Henderson asked. "Right now, if you'd like." "Then get to it. I've got inventory to check." Hannah spent the rest of the morning bent over the ledger, slowly working through Mr. Henderson's terrible handwriting and organizing the accounts into something sensible. It was tedious work, but she found it oddly satisfying, bringing order out of chaos. Mr. Henderson left her alone mostly, only interrupting occasionally to wait on customers. At noon, he told her to take a break and come back in an hour. Hannah stepped outside, stretching muscles cramped from sitting, and found herself walking without any particular destination. The town was busier now, miners and trappers coming in to buy supplies or sell their goods. She saw rough men in furs, families with hopeful expressions, a few women in proper dresses who eyed Hannah with suspicion. She was standing near the blacksmith shop when she heard a familiar voice. "Hannah," she turned, her heart leaping, and there was Hayes. He stood near the hitching post, holding the reins of his mule, and he looked just as surprised to see her as she was to see him. "Hayes," she breathed. "What are you doing here? Had to come get supplies before the next storm hits." His eyes scanned her face, and something in his expression made her pulse quicken. "You made it all right then? Found a place to stay?" "Yes, the boarding house. And I found work at the general store, helping with the books." Hannah found herself smiling, genuinely happy to see him. "What about you?" "Everything all right at the cabin? Fine. Quiet." Hayes stepped closer, and Hannah caught that scent of wood smoke and leather that she'd already come to associate with him. "Those gloves keeping you warm?" She held up her hands, still wearing the rabbit fur gloves even though it wasn't particularly cold. "They're perfect. I haven't taken them off since you gave them to me." Something flickered in his pale eyes. "Good. That's good." They stood there for a moment, neither quite knowing what to say. Around them, the town continued its busy afternoon, but Hannah barely noticed. All her attention was focused on Hayes, on the way he was looking at her like he wanted to say something but couldn't quite find the words. "I should let you get back to work," he finally said. "Don't want to keep you." "Wait," Hannah said impulsively. "Will you be in town long? Maybe we could have dinner at the boarding house. Mrs. Patterson serves at 6. Hayes hesitated, and Hannah held her breath, suddenly terrified he'd say no, that whatever connection she'd felt between them had been entirely one-sided. "I'd like that," he said finally. 6 o'clock, 6 o'clock, Hannah confirmed, unable to keep the smile off her face. She practically floated back to the general store, her heart lighter than it had been in days. Hayes was here. He'd come to town, and maybe it was just for supplies like he said, but he'd seemed genuinely pleased to see her. And he'd agreed to dinner, which meant he wanted to spend more time with her. That had to mean something. The afternoon passed in a blur. Hannah worked on the ledger, but her mind kept drifting to Hayes, to the way he'd looked at her, to the dinner they'd share tonight. She found herself checking her reflection in the store window, trying to smooth her hair, wishing she had something nicer to wear. At 5:30, she thanked Mr. Henderson and hurried back to the boarding house. She had just enough time to wash her face and hands, change into her better dress, and try to tame her hair into something presentable. Her heart pounded as 6 o'clock approached, and she waited in the front parlor, watching the street through the window. Hayes appeared right on time, and Hannah's breath caught. He'd cleaned up too, she realized. His hair was damp, clearly recently washed, and he'd changed into a clean shirt. He'd even trimmed his beard slightly, shaping it more neatly. He looked handsome, devastatingly so, and Hannah had to remind herself to breathe. "You look lovely," Hayes said when she opened the door, and the sincerity in his voice made her blush. "Thank you. You clean up pretty well yourself." Mrs. Patterson raised her eyebrows when Hannah introduced Hayes as a friend, but she set an extra place at the table without comment. Dinner was pot roast with vegetables, and Hannah barely tasted it. She was too aware of Hayes sitting beside her, of the way his knee occasionally brushed hers under the table, of how he seemed as nervous as she felt. The other boarders peppered Hayes with questions, curious about the mountain man in their midst. He answered patiently, telling stories about trapping and survival, about the animals he'd encountered and the harsh beauty of the wilderness. Hannah listened, fascinated, learning things about him she hadn't known before. After dinner, Hayes asked if she'd like to take a walk, and Hannah agreed immediately. They bundled up against the cold, and Hannah pulled on her rabbit fur gloves, not missing the small smile that crossed Hayes's face when he saw them. The town was quiet now, most people having retreated indoors against the cold. Their breath formed clouds in the air as they walked, and Hannah found herself moving closer to Hayes, drawn to his warmth and solidity. "I'm glad you came to town," Hannah said finally, breaking the comfortable silence between them. "I've been thinking about you." "I've been thinking about you too," Hayes admitted. His voice was quiet, almost reluctant. "More than I probably should." "What does that mean?" Hayes stopped walking, turning to face her. In the dim light from the saloon windows, his eyes looked darker, more intense. "It means you've been on my mind constantly since you left. It means I told myself I came to town for supplies, but really I came hoping I'd run into you. It means I'm in danger of doing something very foolish." Hannah's heart raced. "Like what?" "Like asking you to come back to the cabin with me. Like suggesting you forget about California and stay here in Murphy's so I can court you properly. Like admitting that 2 days with you was better than 5 years of solitude." Hayes ran a hand through his hair, looking frustrated with himself. "I know it's crazy. I barely know you. But I feel like I've been waiting for you, like everything before you showed up was just marking time." Hannah couldn't breathe. Everything she'd been feeling, everything she'd been trying to tell herself was foolish or impossible. He felt it too. This wasn't just her imagination or gratitude. This was real, mutual, terrifying, and wonderful all at once. "It's not crazy," she whispered. "Or if it is, then I'm crazy too because I feel exactly the same way." Hayes's expression transformed, hope lighting his features. "You do?" "Yes. I've been miserable since I left your cabin. This room at the boarding house, this work at the store, it all feels empty because you're not there. I thought I was running toward something in California, but maybe I already found what I was looking for." Hayes reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her face in his large, warm hands. "Hannah, I don't have much to offer. My cabin's small, the winters are hard, and life in the mountains isn't easy. But if you'd consider staying, if you'd let me court you properly and see where this goes, I swear I'd do everything in my power to make you happy." "I don't need much," Hannah said, leaning into his touch. "I just need honesty and respect and someone who sees me as an equal. Everything you've already shown me you are." "Can I kiss you?" Hayes asked, his voice rough. "Because I've been wanting to since the moment I saw you in the snow, and if I don't do it soon, I think I might lose my mind." "Yes," Hannah breathed, and then his lips were on hers. The kiss was gentle at first, almost tentative, as if Hayes was afraid of overwhelming her. But when Hannah pressed closer, her hands coming up to grip his shirt, he deepened the kiss, pulling her against his solid chest. It was everything a first kiss should be: sweet and passionate, promising and careful, full of possibility and hope. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Hayes rested his forehead against hers. "Stay," he whispered. "Please give us a chance." "I will," Hannah promised. "I'll stay. For as long as you'll have me." They spent the next few weeks in a state of blissful courtship that had the whole town talking. Hayes came to Murphy's 3 times a week, ostensibly to help Hannah with various tasks, but really just to spend time with her. They took long walks, shared meals at the boarding house, and talked for hours about everything and nothing. Hannah learned about his childhood in Ohio, about the sister he missed, and the mother he felt guilty for avoiding. Hayes learned about her father's death, about her brother's controlling nature, about her dreams of independence and freedom. Hannah continued working for Mr. Henderson, and she picked up additional work sewing for some of the mining families. The money was enough to cover her expenses, and she was slowly building up a small savings. But more importantly, she was building a life, one based on her own choices and desires rather than someone else's expectations. Hayes was unlike any man Hannah had ever known. He listened when she spoke, really listened, and he asked her opinion on things, genuinely wanting to know what she thought. He never talked down to her or dismissed her ideas. When she suggested improvements to his cabin or his trapping routes, he considered them seriously, often implementing her suggestions. He treated her as an equal partner, exactly as she'd always wanted, and he was unfailingly gentle with her, despite his size and strength. His kisses were careful, his touches reverent, as if she was something precious he was afraid to break. But Hannah could feel the passion underneath, the desire he kept tightly controlled, and she found herself wanting more, wanting to know what it would be like when that control finally broke. It was late December, a month after she'd first arrived in Murphy's, when Hayes asked her to marry him. They were sitting in the boarding house parlor, the room empty except for them, a fire crackling merrily in the hearth. Outside, snow was falling again, big soft flakes that reminded Hannah of that first storm that had brought them together. "I know it's fast," Hayes said, holding both her hands in his. "I know people will say we're rushing. But Hannah, I'm 30 years old and I've never felt about anyone the way I feel about you. You make me want things I thought I'd given up on. Family, partnership, a future with someone rather than just existing alone. I love you and I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me?" Hannah felt tears spring to her eyes, but they were happy tears. "Yes," she said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, of course I'll marry you. I love you too, Hayes. I think I have since you first took my hands to measure them for gloves." They were married in early January of 1878 by the circuit preacher who came through Murphy's twice a month. It was a simple ceremony, with Mrs. Patterson and Mr. Henderson standing as witnesses, and Hannah wore her best dress with a wreath of evergreen branches in her hair. Hayes wore a new shirt he'd bought specially for the occasion, and when he said his vows, his voice was steady and sure. "I promise to respect you, to protect you, to be your partner in all things," he said, those pale eyes locked on hers. "I promise to listen when you speak, to value your opinion, to never treat you as less than my equal. I love you, Hannah, and I will until my last breath." Hannah's vows were equally heartfelt, and when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Hayes kissed her with a tenderness that made her heart ache. They were applauded by the small crowd that had gathered, most of the town having turned out for the wedding, and Mrs. Patterson insisted on hosting a celebration dinner at the boarding house. That night, Hayes took her back to his cabin, to their cabin now, and made love to her with the same gentleness and passion he showed in everything else. He was careful with her, making sure she felt safe and cherished, and Hannah fell asleep in his arms feeling happier than she'd ever been in her life. The winter passed in a blur of domestic happiness. Hannah took to mountain life better than either of them had expected. She learned to stretch hides, to preserve meat, to recognize animal tracks in the snow. Hayes taught her to shoot properly, and she practiced until she could reliably hit what she aimed at. She learned which plants were edible, which could be used for medicine, how to predict weather by watching the sky and the animals. In turn, she brought refinements to the cabin that Hayes hadn't bothered with living alone. She sewed curtains for the windows, made cushions for the chairs, organized the supplies more efficiently. She taught Hayes to make bread, real bread rather than the flat, dense thing he'd been eating. She read to him in the evenings from his books, and they discussed philosophy and history and poetry by firelight. They made love frequently, learning each other's bodies, discovering what brought pleasure and joy. Hayes was an attentive lover, always making sure Hannah found her release before seeking his own, and she reveled in the way his control would finally break, the way he'd grip her hips and thrust deep, groaning her name. Spring came eventually, as it always did, and with it came choices. Hannah could have pushed for them to continue west, to head for California as she'd originally planned, but she found she had no desire to leave. The mountains had become home. This cabin had become her sanctuary, and Hayes had become her entire world. "I want to stay here," she told him one morning as they watched the sun rise over the peaks. "Is that all right with you? All right?" Hayes pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. "It's everything I wanted but was afraid to ask for. You're sure, though?" "You're not going to regret giving up your California dreams." "My dream was freedom," Hannah said. "The freedom to make my own choices, to live life on my own terms. I have that here with you. California was just a destination. This is home." In July, Hannah realized she was pregnant. The signs were subtle at first, but unmistakable once she recognized them. She told Hayes one evening after dinner, watching nervously for his reaction. His face lit up like the sun breaking through clouds. "A baby. We're having a baby." "Yes. Probably early February if I'm calculating right." Hayes swept her into his arms, spinning her around despite her laughing protests to be careful. "This is incredible. You're incredible. We're going to be parents." The pregnancy was relatively easy, and Hannah continued helping with the trapping and other chores well into her third trimester. Hayes became almost comically protective, insisting she rest more, not lift anything heavy, wrap up warm against the cold. Hannah found it endearing, even when it was slightly annoying. In late January, as the baby's arrival grew imminent, Hayes insisted they move to Murphy's so Hannah would have access to the midwife. They rented a room at the boarding house, and Mrs. Patterson fussed over Hannah like a mother hen, making sure she had everything she needed. Their son was born on February 3, 1879, in the early morning hours. It was a long labor, and Hayes stayed by her side throughout, holding her hand, wiping her brow, whispering encouragement. When the baby finally emerged, squalling and red-faced, Hayes had tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "He's perfect," he whispered, looking at his son with wonder. "Hannah, he's absolutely perfect." They named him Thomas, after Hannah's father, and he had his mother's dark hair and his father's pale blue eyes. Hayes was a devoted father from the start, changing diapers and walking the floor with the baby when he cried, singing off key lullabies that somehow always soothed Thomas to sleep. They stayed in Murphy's through the spring, wanting to make sure both Hannah and Thomas were strong and healthy before returning to the cabin. But by May, they were all eager to go home. Hayes had added onto the cabin during the winter, building a separate room for the baby, and Hannah had sewn blankets and clothes from soft rabbit fur to keep Thomas warm. Life settled into a new rhythm, one centered around their growing family. Thomas was an easy baby, curious and happy, and he seemed to thrive in the mountain air. Hannah would strap him to her back while she worked, and he'd watch everything with wide, interested eyes. When Thomas was 2, Hannah became pregnant again, and this time they had a daughter. Caroline was born in March of 1881, and she had her father's strength even as an infant, wailing lustily and gripping fingers with surprising force. She was a firecracker from the start, fearless and determined, and Hayes adored her. "She's going to be a handful," he predicted, watching as Caroline took her first steps at just 9 months, refusing to let anyone help her. "She takes after both of us," Hannah said, laughing. "Stubborn and independent." The years flowed by, marked by seasons and growth. Thomas grew tall and serious, thoughtful like his father. Caroline was wild and adventurous, always exploring, always pushing boundaries. In 1884, they had another son, William, who was gentle and artistic, drawing pictures of animals on spare bits of paper. Hannah taught all the children to read and write, using Hayes's books and whatever materials they could get from town. Hayes taught them to track and hunt, to respect nature and understand their place in it. The children grew up strong and capable, comfortable in the wilderness that had once seemed so forbidding to their mother. They made trips to Murphy's regularly, and the children played with the town kids, learning social skills to balance their isolated upbringing. But they always returned to the cabin eagerly, to the mountains and freedom and space. As the children grew older, Hayes and Hannah often found themselves alone again, at least for hours at a time, as the kids explored or helped with chores. Those moments were precious, reminders of how they'd started, just the two of them against the world. "Do you ever regret it?" Hayes asked her one evening. They were sitting on the porch he'd built, watching the sun set over the mountains. The children were inside, supposedly getting ready for bed, but more likely plotting some mischief. Staying here instead of pushing on to California, living this hard life instead of something easier. Hannah took his hand, lacing their fingers together. Even after all these years, after 3 children and countless hardships, his touch still made her heart skip. Not for a single second. "This life, this family, this is everything I was looking for. I just didn't know it until I found it." "I love you," Hayes said, pulling her close. "I've loved you since the moment I saw your hands shake from cold and knew I'd do anything to keep you safe. And you made me gloves from rabbit fur," Hannah added softly, "and warmed my fingers, and warmed my heart, and gave me a life I never dreamed possible." They sat together as darkness fell, comfortable in their silence, secure in their love. Inside, the children's laughter rang out, a fight breaking out over who got to sleep nearest the window. Hayes sighed, preparing to go referee, but Hannah held him back for just a moment. "Thank you," she said, "for seeing me that day in the storm, for taking me in, for choosing me." "You chose me too," Hayes reminded her. "You could have kept running. You chose to stay, to build a life here. That took more courage than anything I did." "We chose each other," Hannah corrected. "And we keep choosing each other every day. That's what makes it work." Hayes kissed her, slow and sweet, a promise and a reminder all at once. Then he stood, holding out his hand to pull her up. "Come on. Let's go deal with our children before they tear down the cabin." Hannah laughed, taking his hand, marveling as always at how perfectly hers fit in his. Together they went inside, to their family, to their life, to the home they'd built in the mountains. Years continued to pass, measured in seasons and milestones. Thomas grew into a young man, tall and strong like his father, with a thoughtful nature that made him a natural leader. At 18, he announced his intention to become a sheriff, wanting to bring law and order to the growing territories. Hayes was proud, though Hannah worried, but they both supported his choice. Caroline, at 16, was as wild as ever, an expert tracker and hunter who could outshoot most of the men in Murphy's. She had no interest in traditionally feminine pursuits, preferring to spend her days in the mountains, and Hannah fiercely defended her daughter's right to choose her own path, just as she had. William, at 14, was the artist of the family, filling journals with sketches of wildlife and landscapes. He talked about going to San Francisco someday, maybe studying at a real art school, and Hayes carefully saved money for that possibility. In 1894, when Hannah was 40, they took a trip to Ohio so Hayes could finally introduce her to his mother and sister. It was a bittersweet journey, showing the children where their father had come from, watching Hayes reconnect with family he'd been avoiding for nearly 2 decades. His mother was older, frailer, but still sharp, and she embraced Hannah with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for bringing my boy back to me, even if it's just for a visit." Hayes's sister, Ellen, was delighted to meet her Western relatives, fascinated by the stories of mountain life. Her own children, soft city kids, stared in awe at their wild cousins who could track animals and start fires and shoot straight. "You did good, little brother," Ellen told Hayes privately. "I worried about you alone in those mountains, but you found happiness. You found love. That's all I ever wanted for you." They returned to Montana after 2 months, all of them eager to see the mountains again. Ohio was nice, but it wasn't home. Home was the cabin Hayes had built, the mountains they all loved, the life they'd created together. As Hannah and Hayes grew older, the children took on more responsibilities. Thomas, working as a deputy now in a town 30 miles away, visited regularly, often bringing news of the changing world. The Wild West was being tamed, he told them, railroads and telegraph lines spreading across the territories. Montana became a state in 1889, part of the growing nation. Caroline, at 24, surprised them all by falling in love with a traveling photographer who'd come through Murphy's documenting the frontier. He was as adventurous as she was, willing to live in the wild places she loved, and they married in the summer of 1893. Hayes gave her away with tears in his eyes, and Hannah marveled at how her fierce daughter had found a partner who celebrated rather than tried to tame her spirit. William did go to San Francisco eventually, winning a scholarship to study art. He wrote them long letters describing the city, the ocean, the incredible things he was learning. His paintings started selling, and he made a name for himself capturing the beauty of the West on canvas. But he always came home for holidays, never forgetting where he'd come from. In 1900, as a new century dawned, Hayes and Hannah celebrated their 22nd anniversary. They were in their mid-40s now, their faces lined with age and weather, but their love had only deepened with time. The cabin had been expanded several times, now a sprawling structure that could accommodate visiting children and grandchildren, because there were grandchildren now. Thomas had 2 sons, rough and tumble boys who loved visiting their mountain grandparents. Caroline and her husband had a daughter, wild and free like her mother. Even William, living in the city, had married and started a family. "We did pretty well, didn't we?" Hayes said one evening. They were alone for once, the visiting families having all departed back to their own homes. The cabin felt enormous and empty without the chaos of children and grandchildren. "We did better than well," Hannah said. She was graying now, as was Hayes, and neither of them moved quite as quickly as they used to. But they were healthy and strong, life in the mountains having kept them fit. "We built something real, something lasting. All because of a blizzard and a pair of gloves," Hayes mused. "Strange how life works sometimes." Hannah looked down at her hands, still strong despite the years. She didn't wear the original rabbit fur gloves anymore. They'd worn out long ago, but Hayes had made her new ones over the years, each pair crafted with the same care as the first. The current pair hung by the door, ready for winter, a constant reminder of where their love had begun. "Not strange," she corrected. "Perfect. It was perfect timing, perfect circumstances, perfectly us. You saw someone who needed help and you helped. I saw someone worth staying for and I stayed. Everything else was just us choosing each other over and over again." Hayes pulled her close, and she rested her head on his shoulder, feeling the solid strength of him that hadn't diminished with age. "I'd choose you again," he said softly. "In every life, in every circumstance, I'd choose you." "And I'd choose you," Hannah promised. They sat together as night fell, 2 people who'd found each other in a storm and built a life in the mountains. Around them, the cabin creaked and settled, full of memories and love. Outside, the wind whistled through the pines, the same wind that had blown all those years ago, bringing a desperate woman to a mountain man's door. As Hannah drifted off to sleep that night, warm in their bed beneath furs and quilts, Hayes's arm around her waist, she thought about the girl she'd been. running from St. Louis with no plan, frozen and afraid, certain she was going to die in that storm. That girl could never have imagined this life, this love, this abundance of family and joy. But the woman she'd become, the woman she'd grown into with Hayes by her side, couldn't imagine any other life. This was where she was meant to be, who she was meant to be with. And it had all started with cold hands, rabbit fur gloves, and a mountain man who'd seen someone worth saving. Years continued their steady march. Hayes and Hannah celebrated 25 years of marriage, then 30, then 35. They slowed down gradually, spending more time on the porch and less time ranging through the mountains. But they were never idle, always working on something, always engaged with life. Their children thrived in their own ways. Thomas became sheriff of his county, respected and fair, carrying his father's integrity and his mother's intelligence. Caroline and her husband became wilderness guides, leading wealthy Easterners on adventures through the mountains. William's paintings hung in galleries across the country, his depictions of Western life celebrated for their honesty and beauty. The grandchildren grew, some staying in Montana, some spreading across the country, all carrying pieces of Hayes and Hannah with them. The lessons of independence and respect, of partnership and courage, passed down through generations. In 1915, as they approached their 37th anniversary, Hayes had a health scare that reminded them both of their mortality. He recovered, but it was a wake-up call. They weren't young anymore, couldn't count on unlimited tomorrows, so they made sure to say the important things, to express the love that had sustained them for nearly 4 decades. They took walks together, slower now but no less meaningful. They sat on their porch and watched sunsets, held hands and remembered. "Tell me again," Hannah said one evening, "about the day we met." Hayes smiled, knowing this story by heart. "I saw you in the storm, half frozen, your hands shaking so hard you couldn't hold the reins. You were the most stubborn, determined woman I'd ever seen, still trying to keep going when anyone with sense would have given up. And you saved me." Hannah continued the familiar story. "We saved each other," Hayes corrected, as he always did. "I gave you gloves and shelter. You gave me a reason to come down from the mountain. You gave me a life worth living." They stayed together on that porch until the stars came out, counting constellations, sharing warmth, being together. And if they held hands a little tighter, treasured each moment a little more, well, they'd earned that wisdom. Their story wasn't one of dramatic adventure or epic tragedy. It was simpler and yet more profound. It was the story of two people who'd found each other when they most needed it, who'd chosen partnership over solitude, who'd built a family and a life based on mutual respect and genuine love. It was the story of cold hands warmed by rabbit fur gloves, of a mountain man who saw beyond his own needs, of a woman brave enough to choose her own path. It was a story of the Wild West, yes, but more importantly, it was a story of the human heart's capacity for love and transformation. And it was, in every way that mattered, a story with a happy ending. When Hayes Irving passed away peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1918, at the age of 68, Hannah was holding his hand. She sat with him for a long time after, remembering their years together, grateful for every moment they'd shared. She was 73 herself, strong still, but she knew her own time was growing shorter. She arranged his funeral with the help of their children, and it seemed like half the territory came to pay respects. The wild mountain man had become something of a legend, and people wanted to honor him. But Hannah knew the truth. Hayes had never been larger than life. He'd simply been a good man who'd tried his best, who'd loved fiercely and lived honorably. Hannah lived 2 more years after Hayes died, staying in the cabin they'd shared, refusing all offers to move in with the children. She wanted to be here, in the home they'd built, surrounded by memories of their life together. She spent those years writing, filling journals with stories for the grandchildren and great-grandchildren who were coming along. She wanted them to know their history, to understand where they'd come from. She wrote about Hayes, about their courtship and marriage, about the love that had sustained them through everything. And she wrote about those first moments, about frozen hands and rabbit fur gloves, about a mountain man who'd shown unexpected kindness to a stranger. Those gloves, the original pair, worn and fragile now, hung in a place of honor on the cabin wall. They were the beginning of everything. Hannah Bellamy Irving died in her sleep on a spring morning in 1920, 6 weeks after her 75th birthday. She was found by Thomas, who'd come to check on her, and her face was peaceful, almost smiling. Next to her bed, worn smooth with handling, were those first rabbit fur gloves Hayes had made for her all those years ago. She was buried next to Hayes on a hillside overlooking the mountains they'd both loved. Their children and grandchildren gathered to say goodbye, to celebrate lives well lived, to mourn and remember and give thanks. The cabin remained in the family, passed down through generations, maintained and cherished. The rabbit fur gloves were preserved, a family heirloom, a tangible reminder of where it had all begun. And the story of the mountain man and the woman he'd saved lived on, told and retold, each generation adding their own understanding and appreciation, because it was a story worth remembering. A story of kindness and courage, of love found in unexpected places, of two people who'd saved each other in all the ways that mattered. It was a story of the Wild West, of Montana Territory in the harsh winter of 1877, but it was also a story that transcended time and place. It was a story of cold hands and warm hearts, of rabbit fur gloves that sparked a romance, of a mountain man who'd seen a woman in need and offered help without expectation of reward. It was a story of Hannah, brave enough to run and wise enough to stay when she found something worth staying for. And most of all, it was a love story, as true and real as the mountains themselves, enduring through decades and hardship and change, proving that sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected moments. A blizzard, a pair of cold hands, and a mountain man with rabbit fur and kindness to spare. That's how legends begin. That's how love stories are born. That's how two people became forever, written in the history of a family, of a place, of the Wild West itself. And somewhere in the mountains of Montana, in a cabin lovingly maintained by descendants who never forgot, those gloves still hang on the wall, soft rabbit fur worn thin but still holding warmth, still telling their story to anyone who'll listen. The story of Hayes and Hannah, of hands that shook from cold and fingers that were warmed, of love that lasted a lifetime and beyond. The end of their lives, but never the end of their story. That continues, passed down through bloodlines and memories, as enduring as the mountains they called home, as warm as the rabbit fur gloves that started it all.